Hello everyone, my name is Andrew and welcome back to Frames of Space. Today, I would like to begin by focusing on something that's been on my mind since Tuesday night. Donald Trump's latest speech to the joint session of Congress. Now, if you've watched it, you know that it was exactly what you'd expect from Trump. A mix of lies, conspiracy theories, and a whole lot of pretending. Pretending the economy is thriving when the stock market is actually plummeting. Pretending that America is thriving and united when he's actively sowing division and hatred throughout our country. It was a bad speech, but it was bad in a way that's become almost predictable at this point. But here's the thing. While the content of the speech was reprehensible, it wasn't the speech itself that stuck with me. It was what happened afterwards. At the end of the address, when Trump finished talking about how America is going to thrive, something fascinating unfolded. The Democrats stayed completely silent, while the Republicans responded to his speech by erupting into a standing ovation. And then Trump did something that really caught my attention. He stood up, walked around, and started shaking hands with his fellow Republicans.
Thank you, darling.
Chris, thank you. I love you. And better speech over there.
President.
Yeah, it was so good.
Thanks.
So good.
Hey, you rocked it, Mr. President. We're with you, 100%. Crush. Really good.
Congratulations, President. Best speech ever. Thank you.
Now, I've seen a lot of political theater over my years covering politics, but this was different. The way these Republicans greeted him, it wasn't just polite applause or a quick handshake. They were actively enthusiastic, warm. They were compliant, they were loyal. They told him it was the best speech ever, that everything he said was true, that it was one of the greatest moments in American history. When you look at that moment, Trump shaking hands, Republicans fawning over him, you could assume that they're feeling joy. Joy at being part of his inner circle, joy at the privilege of serving him. And to some extent, I think that's true. But I also think there's another layer to it. I think these Republicans are choosing to feel joy because they're afraid of feeling fear. This idea, this interplay between joy and fear, it's something that we're going to explore in today's episode. And to help us unpack it, I've brought on a guest who has a unique perspective on all of this. His name is Erik Engheim. Erik is a Substack writer who spent a lot of time untangling history, politics, and culture from a Nordic perspective. And, as someone who's watched American politics from the perspective of an outsider, he's gotten some really fascinating insights into why people support the leaders that they support. Now, here's something really interesting about Erik. In the past few weeks, he realized that he was wrong about Trump supporters. He used to look at them with disdain, assuming that if you supported someone like Trump, you must be ignorant, stupid, or a bad person. But now he's come to see things differently. In one of his articles, he writes that he sees that there's another option that, quote, I have not seriously considered, which puts many Republicans in a different light to me. Maybe, just maybe, they don't support all the horrible stuff Trump says and does despite being informed of it. That's a powerful shift in perspective, and it's one that we're going to dig into today. Today's episode is all about the psychology of MAGA. Why do people support the leaders they support? What drives that loyalty? And what role does fear play in all of it? I'm really excited to have Erik on the show because he provides an outsider's perspective to all of this. As a Norwegian, he spent a lot of time consuming both Norwegian and American content, and it's fascinating to see how that shaped his outlook. So before we dive in, I just want to finish this intro by presenting the following thought. When we see people acting in ways that seem irrational or incomprehensible, it's very easy to dismiss them as ignorant or evil. But maybe there's a lot more to it. What if, beneath the surface, there's a much more complex mix of emotions? Joy, fear, loyalty, sometimes desperation, And maybe that complex mix of emotions is what is driving their behavior. And that is what we are going to explore today. So let's get to it. Erik Engheim, thank you so much for taking the time to come onto this podcast.
Thank you, Andrew, for having me.
Yeah. So to the audience, we were actually just like bantering a little bit about like your experience in Norway, and then you brought up this one journalist that went to America, and then I had to abruptly cut you off because I knew that we had to save it for the episode. Maybe that's just like a starting like hook for the audience. So explain the thing that you were going to explain to me before I cut you off.
Yeah. So he's a pretty interesting guy because he was.
Tell the audience his name.
His name was Thomas Seltzers. And he was in a band that was fairly big in Norway called Turboneger. And it's some years ago, so I'm not sure if like younger people would know that now, but there might be international audience that know it. But anyway, he pivoted away from, being in music and like that. And he started having a show in Norway called Trygdekontoret, which is sort of like debate thing, a little bit like maybe what we do now. There's a couple of people that sit in a studio and so on, and talk about different issues. What's been interesting with him for the last few years is that he's done this show for the Norwegian national broadcaster, where he travels back to his old America and he visits friends, family, and different people in America.
His old America, like the United States?
Yeah, United States. So he's trying to take the pulse, like, what's happened to America? And his story is kind of interesting because when he went from America in the 70s to Norway, he described it as sort of going from this land of opportunity where everything was possible, everything was positive and upbeat, and he comes to this sort of almost quasi-Soviet state that Norway was in the 1970s. It was very, we didn't have a lot of products in the grocery stores, or it's a very planned economics, almost in a sense. Norway in the 70s still. Very influenced by the old Labour Party policies. And so he was kind of feeling a bit down that he came to Norway. It sort of, I guess maybe he's born here. I don't remember exactly his story. But now that he comes back to the United States, he did this some years ago with the first Trump presidency, and he's been doing it now again before the election. It feels to him, and I think also that us viewers can see as well, it feels like the roles have completely swapped. So the U.S. is sort of like, having all these problems. He goes to, these Appalachian towns, mining towns with a lot of the hardship, the opioid crisis, a lot of these different things. And what was relevant, what I want to mention to you here was actually he interviewed some MAGA guys, and they explain the experience of coming out of it and being inside it, which reminded me of when you meet some former KKK or neo-Nazi or jihadist or gang member or something like that, and they talk about sort of, I don't know, the whole brainwash or thing they're inside. And he talked about the whole siege mentality, that in the MAGA world there was a sense of crisis all the time, a sense of attack. And you just had to react.
Yeah, like you're constantly under fire. Like everyone is out to get you. Everyone, like you're in danger from everyone else, and that's why you have to stick with MAGA people.
Yeah, and I really love what he was doing, because I watch a lot of American media, probably more than Norwegian, and I think there's a lot in American media, like, Meadows or, probably a lot of others, TYT Network. There's a lot of that focus right on the badness of the MAGA. And I think what Thomas Seltzer was really, I liked about him is he's a guy who comes into this with a lot of compassion. So he's talking with people that, someone like me sees as like someone having very negative views and perspectives on the world. But, a lot of his family and relatives and people he loved, they are MAGA people. And he's trying to understand why are they in this?
Wait, his
thing?
family, are you referring to the reporter, Thomas Seltzer?
Yeah, the reporter, he has a lot of family still in the U.S., and many of them, from what I understand, are kind of MAGA people. And they're people that often have a hard time, and it also doesn't make sense. A lot of why would they support Trump? The policies doesn't make any sense from the perspective of what their life is like.
And like maybe if you're someone who's left wing, you might watch Trump on television. You might have like seen him like do all of his speech like in the State of the Union earlier this week, and like a left winger might listen to Trump and be like, who the hell is this guy, and why do so many people support him? Like, I know so many people, like a lot of my friends on the left, where they would listen to Trump and be like, why the hell does anyone support this idiot? And like, I'm sympathetic to that worldview, but maybe that means that we should try to understand why they support him.
Yeah, I'm very much of the school that believe that people that we see as bad. I never liked the word, for instance, evil. I don't generally call people that are bad things that, because what does that explain? I think people that do bad things, it's more of a question of malfunction. It's like a program that has bugs in it in a way and needs to be fixed. Because it does. Now, how does it help us move along? You know, we had the terror attack in 2011 here in Norway, Utøya, where about 80 people got shot teenagers got shot at the island, and he blew up a bomb here in Oslo. And after that, it was like a shock. You know, Norway is a very peaceful country. It's very low homicide rate and things like that. It's not, you know, the parliament here in Norway, you can be a regular citizen and just walk straight in. There's no much security or anything. We're just used to that. You can just trust everybody. And so it was like out of this world when this happened here. And I try to understand how could he end up doing that, right? So I read his manifesto, and that was for me a kind of a starting point, also just trying to understand
the manifesto of that terrorist, like for the 2011 terrorist attack in Norway.
Yeah, exactly. I read that to understand what is actually he's thinking, his mindset. And I think one thing that and it was part of why I'm very interested in American politics too, is he wasn't radicalized in Norway. He tried to join different groups here, but we don't really have, like, there's no KKK or neo-Nazis really to talk about here. And the far right or the populist right party here that he tried to join, they're just not radical enough. He got basically kicked out. So he found actually more people that he related to was partly like the English Defense League, but it was also a lot of it was people I recognize in the U.S., right? A lot of people that will show up on Fox News and so on, or Breitbart or whatever. So a lot of his inspiration was actually the American right. So the interesting thing is, right, before you got to get radicalized in your local community, but now you can get radicalized online, right? People that don't even live in your country that can radicalize you. And so I think for us as foreigners or even living outside the U.S., what's happening in the U.S. is very important for all of us because America has such an immense media power, right? For us to understand MAGA, it's kind of important because they do influence what happens here as well. We saw during the COVID-19 period, we suddenly started seeing a lot of the anti-vax rhetoric popping up here and affecting vaccinations and so on here. And it wasn't something happening domestically from groups here, but it was things just coming in from sort of the American media reality in a way. So yeah, we're a very interconnected world now, right? I mean, we just meet each other randomly, right? We're totally different countries.
Yeah, globalization, what can I tell you?
Yeah.
Yeah. So like, just to spend one last bit of time on this before I move to the main topic, maybe the way you would describe it is that like, there are a lot of people where maybe they have some far-right inclinations or far-right tendencies, but like if they go at their local community, like they wouldn't really find anyone who would espouse the same radical views. So maybe in the past they would just give up and then just like go back to focusing on just like normal kitchen table issues within their local community. But nowadays, the fact that social media and the internet is like literally everywhere means that they can always go to like whatever place they can to find whatever the most extremist view is and then identify there, basically.
Yeah, exactly. I think that happens with everything. It's not just say something like MAGA or white supremacy, but it could be something like, say, the incel stuff, right? Where you struggle a bit with dating, and then I felt like, when I was doing it, it's more like, yeah, maybe you're a bit upset with women and stuff, but eventually you just have to figure it out for yourself. But now it's like, no, you don't have to figure it out for yourself. You just find a like-minded community that has all the right answers, where you can kind of get radicalized and go down a rabbit hole, right? And the social media algorithms just push you down the rabbit hole. I mean, because I'm interested in understanding more of far right, I notice when I click some of these links on YouTube, I start getting flooded with far right stuff. So,
yeah. I think it's very interesting. Like, maybe we're kind of lucky in that we grew up, and then we experienced what things were like right before. But I want to continue this conversation with a quote from an article from Big Think, where it's featuring this one neuroscientist that's talking about how humans, like, their brains often hardwire them to see the world in a specific way. She refers to these as like cognitive scripts, like all of the secondary signals that your brain often tells you about what to do next. So I'm going to quote that article. Quote, "One of the most dominant cognitive scripts is the sequel script, the assumption that the next chapter of our lives must logically follow from the last. We stick to careers we no longer enjoy, remain in relationships that no longer serve us, and avoid exploring opportunities that seem inconsistent with who we have been. This self-consistency fallacy stems from our brain's preference for familiar narratives, stories that make sense and offer direction, reassuring us that we are on the right track." So, do you notice this some of the time, where like your own inner thinking about what actions you should take with your life, or like the political people that you should affiliate with, sometimes a lot of that is contingent on like your own experiences of who you've identified with in the past compared to what is the most rational decision for the here and now?
Yeah, I think I introspect a lot about that because I've seen so much extremism and how people that seem very smart and rational to me end up just crazy, down a crazy rabbit hole. And so I do often sort of stop and try to reflect on, am I in danger of doing anything like that myself?
Yeah,
because,
like it's very easy for someone who, for example, identifies as a socialist. It's very easy for them to become way too sympathetic to like authoritarian communists, and like
exactly.
Yeah,
and that's something that I think you have to be like than me as a democratic socialist. I know that there's a kind of a dark past there where people, were blinded a lot to a lot of the bad stuff, right? And I think that they did the same thing that you see with MAGA today, that they get so preoccupied with their goals, and that becomes so important that they're just kind of like, oh, okay, so there's some bad stuff happening here, but we're going to tolerate it because those people are so bad. So we are going to forge ahead anyway.
Yeah.
There is one thing that is sort of, because it comes up a lot when, at least naturally from my sort of ideological standpoint, is I think context matters a lot for how it happened, both for if you're the far right or you're far left and so on, is if I look at history, I think that what you've seen a lot, whether you look at Franco's Spain or Germany or Italy, you've seen actually fairly developed democracies, or kind of modern, at least for their time area, fairly developed countries that have democracy or some kind of democracy, and they choose actually to go towards totalitarianism. And I think sort of in a little bit defense in sort of my side of the fence is, for the left, it's generally been that the totalitarianism has followed from existing totalitarianism, right? That's been pretty underdeveloped countries where governments have been overthrown that was already oppressing people, and then you got a new dictatorship. So it reminds me a little bit of, if you look at the French Revolution, and they overthrew the king, but then you had the Robespierre's reign of terror afterwards. I think that happens a lot when you overthrow a dictatorship. It's very common, it seems, you get another dictatorship, sometimes even a worse dictatorship. And I suspect that's because this is, for me, is a big important principle, is that, you have to follow democratic means for change, because when you're using violence to effectuate change, it's not the best people that move to the top of the pyramid of your power hierarchy. It's the worst. It's the people who are most effective at doing violence, and those are going to lead your movement in the future, right? And you've seen that in the Arab Spring and many other places. But we who are on the side, so we had Norwegians, right, in Norway, part of what was called the AKP-ML movement in the 70s. They lived in a democracy, and they could look at what was happening in China and Cambodia and so on.
Yeah, like they would see dictators like Pol Pot or like communists like Mao Zedong, and like even though they were doing horrific, completely brutal, and sometimes genocidal things, like socialists in Norway were still sympathetic to them.
Well, it's a very small portion of them. I mean, most of the socialists in Norway, right, was part of the Social Democratic Party, the Labour Party, which had around 50% of the vote. And this party, AKP-ML, was about 1% of the vote, if that. So they were a tiny minority of extremists. So they were extreme socialists among a much larger group of much more moderate socialists who did turn their back on these movements. And I think that that's also the thing, right? It's like there's always been heavy criticism among socialists against other socialists who embrace more totalitarian approaches. Like, George Orwell is a well-known guy for that. But yeah, I think it's like you want to make sure that you're among the the sensible crowd as opposed to the AKP ML kind of crowd. Yeah, fortunately that petered out. I think even they had to sort of realize eventually that there's a lot of the people that were there were quite sort of prominent people in Norway. There was kind of very intellectual people, so there's some of them are some of the best known authors in Norway.
Like a vocal minority.
Yeah, it's like for a lot of kind of radical socialism has often been very highly educated intellectual people, and so we had kind of a bunch of them that are people that are actually now in kind of high positions in Norway, but have turned their back on that. But one famous guy is what was his name? Solberg or something. He's a well-known author in Norway, and he wrote a book called something like High School Teacher Pedersen, which is about kind of his time in the AKP ML movements in the 70s. And it's like this guy, it's a bit like Jesus. He bikes on the water because his faith in the movement is so strong. And it's sort of like the author himself is sort of ridiculing a bit how they were back then. Their faith in this whole idea was a bit like religious.
Yeah. I think that that's very interesting, like the way that we sort of identify with specific groups, and like those groups may have like a small grain of truth to them, but like it's very easy to take that small grain of truth and then like you end up getting led down a rabbit hole where you end up becoming radicalized into becoming an extremist.
Yeah.
But, yeah. I think that...
How do you prevent that,
Yeah. It's very hard, but it's also very worthwhile. I think one of the things I've been trying to do is I've been trying to like find articles or political commentators where those political commentators often acknowledge the grain of truth that their side is failing to acknowledge, while also at the same time condemning the more like reactionary bad stuff that like a lot of people who do acknowledge that grain of truth often end up leading to.
Yeah, and I think about that too, because I try to sort of, I feel like I don't have any credibility criticizing MAGA, I think, if I can see problems on the left as well. And one thing I find interesting is when you point out things that you think is actually wrong on the left, I found that there's all these right-wingers who are like, oh, you must be a centrist or you're a moderate. And I'm like, no, I'm actually really far left. I'm literally a socialist. And it made me really think about that there's a difference between being a centrist politically, like where are you on the spectrum, and your objectiveness.
Yeah.
I think those two, it's conflated. It's treated as if being centrist means being objective, and being quite far on one end or the other is necessarily being not objective. Sometimes they go together, right? But I think those can be separated. I think that you can find quite moderate leftists, almost centrists, just plain liberals who have a lot of crazy views that they're not really introspecting very well and only see negative things about MAGA, or can't even see that they have half a point about some things. It's weird for me because I'm so far left, but I can still see a lot of these things. But maybe because I do value that you have to try to be objective, and like there's a difference between sort of your vision of society, like, your role of government, people, workers, and so on. That's different from how you actually observe facts, I think. Is global warming real or not? That's not the same question as if should markets have less influence in the economy. There's very different kinds of things. One is about values, the other is about objective facts. And I think people conflate the two very much.
Yeah. But I guess I do want to get going to the main topic of this episode. So if you don't mind, I want you to talk about how you felt about MAGA and how you felt about Trump supporters before last February. Like, obviously, you wrote that piece titled "I Was Wrong About Trump Supporters" that I really loved. Mm-hmm. But I want you to describe how you felt about Trump supporters before that moment in the article, like before all of that happened. How would you have characterized Trump supporters?
I think I've oscillated a lot on how I think about it, and I still do, because, I had many years ago, I met relatives in a very conservative state, and I didn't understand how conservative people. I had very dismissive of conservatism, Republicans.
Was this the first time you visited the U.S.?
I've been there as just tourist. I was in the U.S. first time 1995. I was actually at Trump Tower, or Trump Tower, I think. But this is the first time I heard about him.
Like, this is the first time that you visited like a deep red state because you were like visiting relatives?
This was sort of the first time I got a sense of what people are like, because I didn't really... When you're just a tourist and you eat your McDonald's burgers and you look at the Statue of Liberty or whatever, you don't really have a sense of what people are like. I mean, ironically, for me, I learned a lot indirectly about American culture, how Americans live life, through Simpsons. That sounds silly, but for instance, I noticed that Simpsons, they went to church every Sunday, and I was like, do they really do that? Because like here, it's like, oh, you go at Christmas or something, or with school once a year. That, and I was actually, I was writing actually physical letters with one of my relatives, and I got to know them, but like that before I went over. And that was certainly an eye-opener, because so many of the views that Republicans have just seem almost evil to me. And I struggle understanding how could nice people hold those views. And I got a better understanding of it being there. And I was actually very impressed by the sense of community that was there. So this was actually in Utah, so it's a bit special. It's not regular Republican stuff. I would say that Mormons in general have a lot of very positive traits that still impress me, even if it's I think sort of their religion and stuff is kind of nutty, but it's the people. It's somehow they made some really nice people, and things I could see in the families and so on that really impressed me. So yeah, that. But it's been since then, oscillating, trying to sort of square with the fact that people can hold such, I would say, as kind of bigoted views on things. And I think that prior to I read that article, I think I was more fixed on this idea that, if you, after all you've seen of Trump, his first year, the in-between and so on, everything, if you still support him, I just couldn't see how that was possible without you either having these terrible views yourself, so just not being a very good person, or two, that you were just completely ignorant, like you just hadn't followed news or knew anything about anything, so you just didn't know what you were choosing, or you were just too stupid to really analyze the situation correctly. And so the article, I guess, was sort of the fourth option, that you actually do see that a lot of this is bad. You're not stupid. You're not ignorant, but you're just simply afraid of leaving your tribe and everything that you've been part of.
Yeah. So just to lay the groundwork, just in the off chance that maybe there are some people here that are listening and have been living under a rock for the past 2 months, because I do think that there are, unfortunately, a lot of people that are not following the news right now. So could you give a TLDR about what President Trump's policies with regards to Ukraine and Russia have been over the past month or so, just to paint the scene for the audience?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I'm a good characterization of that, but it seems to me that he's just basically he's kind of siding with Putin, basically, and he's in a way, he's just trying to use pressure to make Ukraine yield to or surrender. So what he calls peace, to me, just sounds like a surrender by, threatening to cut military aid, intelligence sharing, all these different money transfers, all these different things that Ukraine depend on, and it seems to be about ratcheting up the pressure to make Ukraine surrender to a peace deal. And from, I listened to Hegseth, and it seems like they're saying all these things that Ukraine should accept, right? Give away territory to Russia, give away Crimea, and they're not getting any. And when he asked, so what does Ukraine get? And he couldn't answer it, right? There was nothing didn't get a security guarantee. They didn't get really any of their land back. Which is, why should they agree to a term which is just only giving Russia things? And it seems the Trump approach to getting them to agree on that is just twisting their arm. So it's not by offering Ukraine more things to make it palatable. It's not giving a carrot, but it's just taking out the stick and beating them with it. It's like, okay, comply, surrender.
Yeah, I will stop beating you with the stick if you do what I want you to do, basically.
Yeah, exactly. I guess that's basically how I see that. And they're not even they will say things like, Vladimir Zelensky is a dictator. And
yeah, Trump
probably debate that, but
Trump called Zelensky a dictator on Truth Social, just to the audience. Yeah.
And maybe you could debate that. But certainly if you're going to call anyone a dictator, it has to be Putin first. And he's not willing to say that. So it's a double standard.
Yeah. And there was, you must have really been living under a rock if you don't know this, but there was one time where Trump and his vice president, J.D. Vance, invited the president of Ukraine, Zelensky, over to the White House, and they just spent several minutes just constantly berating him and yelling at him and just engaging in victim blaming towards him the whole time.
And I think that's an important point, because I see I watch some Fox News commentary, and there's always say about Canada, and I think this applies to this case too, where they're second guessing or explaining what Trump actually meant, basically. Yeah. So it's like they're saying, oh, but Trump isn't against Canada. Or, and you might say this, oh, he's not attacking Ukraine or whatever. He's just trying to get peace, whatever. But the thing is, Trump is selling himself, and that's what they're selling Trump as this great negotiator. And if you cannot communicate in a way where you're not being seen as this abrasive, offensive villain, then certainly, if that's not what you want to get across, then certainly you are not a good communicator. You're not good at your job. Whatever Trump wants to achieve in Europe or in Canada or Ukraine, he comes across to all of us as a big bully. And if that's not the intention, well, then he's not talented at what he does. He's bad at diplomacy. He's bad at deal making. So you can't have, if you're going to get us to agree that Trump is not a horrible person, then you have to agree that he is really lacking in talent when it comes to actually communicating. They seem to want both. We're just supposed to understand Trump, that there's a deeper, better 4D chess world underneath there.
Yeah, like whenever Trump says something that they support, it's a sign that like he is actually like a saint. But when he says something that they don't support, it's a sign that he's secretly playing 4D chess, or this is like some secret negotiating tactic, or we're supposed to trust that he actually means something completely different.
Yeah, exactly. And then what you can say, well, all his European allies read this differently. So obviously, he's not a good communicator.
Yeah. Yeah. So, but then, like, with regards to European allies and the way that they reacted, there was one part of your article that I thought was so fascinating. Like, you were watching a debate where the Prime Minister of Norway was like debating about NATO, and he brought up like a lot of Trump's really inflammatory and incendiary comments about Ukraine. And you said that moment, like, it impacted you and it fundamentally shifted the way that you feel about Trump supporters. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, because I think it's like realizing it's very easy to just slam them, right? We're just talking about how terrible they are. But
we're talking about like how terrible MAGA is, you mean? Yeah,
it's very easy to slam how terrible MAGA is. But I'm, and maybe that's because I'm more of a radical leftist, is I'm a little bit fed up of the centrists as well, and I see him as a little bit of that kind of overly radical centrists, as maybe I would call them, which is they're trying to downplay all the time how extreme and dangerous Donald Trump is, and I feel that's too much. It's running his errand. If you're always minimizing what he is about, then you are hindering people from seeing the truth. And so I see that there's what I talk about with fear, of the fear of leaving your tribe for MAGA, that might see that they're not really part of the good guys. I think there's a similar thing going on among what I call the radical centrists, which is they are very afraid of leaving the established status quo that we live in now, where America is our security.
Yeah, like America is like your big best friend that will protect you from. Yeah.
And they just don't want to let go of that because it's scary. They don't want to alarm. I mean, this is typical, right? Very century stuff. They don't want to alarm people. So they sugarcoat everything to the point where it's just undermining the things you need to do. I think you have to be speaking plain about what MAGA stands for and what Trump stands for. And I don't think a lot of this regular old school moderate European leadership really understands how to deal with that. To me, they're acting like Neville Chamberlain. There's like, it's equivalent of Hitler. I'm not saying Trump is Hitler, but because that's maybe pulling it too far. But there's a similar dynamic where, Hitler goes and takes the Sudetenland, right? And it's like, oh, well, and there's all this stuff, in Mein Kampf, he's like, oh, yeah, we want to invade Russia and we want to get rid of Jews. And it's like, oh, well, he just talks. He just talks in big letters. He's just an unusual politician. Let's not put too much weight into that. And you saw how we screwed ourselves over by not taking it serious. And I know the intention is good. By downplaying it, you don't want to cause alarm.
Yeah, you don't want to create false alarms like some people have done in the past.
Yeah, exactly. But when there actually is serious stuff and you need to actually get up and act, then
Yeah.
you can't just keep sugarcoating this. He is not a normal leader.
There's one quote from the article that ties into this, so I'm going to quote it right now. Quote, "Losing America as an ally is scary. And so our politicians walk on eggshells around Trump. They try a balancing act to make sure they say that they don't really agree with his views while watering it down as much as possible to avoid upsetting Trump and risking our military alliance." End quote. Do you think that we live in times like we've entered into a fundamentally different political environment where it's kind of scary to let go of what we like our previous conception of what politics was like back then, because things are so different now that it's a lot easier to engage in denial rather than admit how different things are?
Yeah, I think somebody had on internet compared it to an abusive relationship, and I think that's really very similar now, where...
Yeah, and to be clear, the analogy of an abusive relationship, it's not meant to condescend or make fun of people. It's meant as a way to express sympathy towards them.
Yeah, I think it's... absolutely. It's like, I mean, I feel for the people that are downplaying what Trump is about. They're trying to do the best for us. They're trying to do what they're trying to salvage what we had. That's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just about, you got to wake up to reality now. And I think that's what's happened also in an abusive relationship. A lot of people are in denial a very long time. They don't want to admit that they're victims or that their partner is as bad as they actually are. And it means that it takes too long time to get out of it. And I think that Europe has had a relatively good relationship with the U.S. for a long time and don't want to get out of it. But the signs have been there a long time. And we had the Bush presidency. It was pretty bad then. And we just were like, oh, well, it'd be better later. And then you have then you have Obama, and it's sort of, okay, now it's great, America's our best friend. But it's like this kind of realization we should have had a long time ago, I think, in Europe, is it get these kind of pretty bad leaders, whether it's George Bush or Donald Trump, they keep coming back. There's the MAGA stuff is not just out of the blue. You had the Tea Party and all that. You've had the neocons. You had a lot of these problematic movements that never been really dealt with. And I don't think, and Biden was very naive, I think, in that regard. So,
one thing that really struck with me is that you mentioned a study about women that were doing job interviews, and basically they asked these women, let's say that you are doing a job interview, you apply for a position at a job, and then you're getting interviewed to see whether you would make it to the position. They asked them, how do you think that you would react if you were being sexually harassed, in this job interview? Could you talk to me about how they thought that they would react?
Yeah, so I guess it's a little bit, we see ourselves maybe often a little bit more forceful maybe than we would be in real life. And when described, I think, most women be like, oh, I'd be outraged if somebody did that. I would cuss that guy out. And then when it actually kind of happened similar, they weren't prepared for it happening. And they couldn't sort of do something say directly touch them. So it was more about very inappropriate questions. So it was actually a mild form of sexual harassment in that regard. But they did not just speak out and cuss out the guy asking it. It was the opposite. They became more compliant, more friendly.
Yeah, and they acted if you were to watch this out of context without an understanding of the situation, you would think that they were being more enthusiastic even.
Yeah, you would think that they were totally fine with it. And it's because they afterwards, they fell out of fear. They were trying to sugarcoat it and be as compliant and friendly as possible so that to sort of avoid feeling like something worse wouldn't happen. And I think I thought about a lot of that because I think a lot of sort of toxic masculinity and a lot of bad male behavior happens because a lot of guys that do bad things, they don't get actually the feedback they need to get because superficially, it looks like to them that, oh, the women are fine with my shitty behavior. And I think it's like that it doesn't need to be about women or sexual harassment. It can be for so many other things in life where I think people start acting friendly and compliant when there's something that actually they really, really don't like. And I think if you're not very good at reading people, you won't pick that up. And I think a lot of people that I see as a kind of toxic behavior, they're very bad at reading other people. They have a poor sort of theory of mind.
Yeah, I guess then that makes me a little bit more sympathetic in that, like, I think it kind of makes me a little bit more sympathetic to both parties, because there's there's an unintentional failure of communication going on, where like one party feels they feel terrible, but they're like, the fact that they don't have the courage to externalize it, which obviously is not their fault, means that the other person who is like continuing to do the thing that is bad, like they don't really have a feedback mechanism to recognize it. And if they were given that feedback mechanism in a straightforward way, maybe they would just immediately stop doing it.
Yeah, and I think that's with so many things, right? We there's like give and take. We need to sort of try to help each other out. What makes me sort of negative to a lot of these kind of I don't know, over toxic masculine kind of guys is that you point these things out, and you're saying, you have to try to be a little bit more aware of how this might be seen. And they're like, no, that's the woman's fault. She has to speak up. It's like, you can't just dump it all on somebody else. Like, everyone has to pull their own weight here. Everybody has to try to help out.
So yeah, maybe like there's a grain of truth to what they're saying, but they're extending it too far, essentially.
Yeah. And it's like, when you read stuff like that, right, you have to, whether you're a man or a woman or whatever side you're on, you have to realize this and then be part of the solution, right? You have to do your little bit. You can't just be like, oh, that's the other party's fault, right? They have to do all of it.
And like, it's not even necessarily like 100% incorrect. It's more that like everyone has to do their own part, basically.
Yeah. I don't know how exactly necessarily, for women, I'm not sure how would you do that, because it's like, if you're afraid, how are you going to just tell people, well, you have to just speak up? Maybe that's not the right thing to say. But I know there's for other cases where, for instance, women tend to hint a lot more and guys don't pick up the hint. So maybe you need to say that, well, guys need to work a little bit on picking up the hints, but also women need to be a little bit more explicit about what they want. So, there's...
Yeah. And I feel like this just like, I wish that I could go on like a 30-minute tangent about how much sympathy I have for both parties, but like that's neither here nor there. Let's stay on topic right now. Yeah. Yeah. But yeah, so when you talk about how like victims often respond, instead they don't respond by being angry, they respond by being more like compliant and more agreeable and even more friendly. There was a moment earlier this week where I was watching the State of the Union where Trump was like rambling about a bunch of nonsense about how like he has the best economy in the world, or like he like Biden had the worst inflation in the world, and a bunch of other nonsense. But then it ended, like Democrats were just like completely silent. Republicans were giving Trump a standing ovation. And then when Trump was the camera lingered for a little bit where Trump was basically greeting all the other Republicans, and like the Republicans were acting incredibly friendly and they were acting incredibly enthusiastic. Like I remember different Republicans would go up to him, they would shake his hand and be like, "Oh, you just gave the best speech of all time," or like they would nod, and they like I could tell in their eyes they just looked so much more enthusiastic. They looked so much more supportive of Trump. And I feel like if I hadn't read your article before watching that State of the Union, I would have felt just completely repulsed by those Republicans and how much they were sucking up to Trump. But now it almost feels like they're choosing to, like, when they were shaking Trump's hand and saying, "You gave the best speech of all time," or whatever nonsense they were saying. It almost felt like they were choosing to feel joy because they were afraid of feeling fear. Or at least that's how I would characterize it. Like,
yeah, I think that's an interesting thought. When you see how vicious he is against people who oppose him, might feel a genuine fear of going against it, and an almost like a natural inclination, and you don't even think about being nice and compliant towards him.
Yeah,
because
because like
you're not maybe even processing it that you are actually afraid of him.
yeah, like you're not like he's incredibly vicious to people who oppose him, but he's also incredibly enthusiastic and supportive of the people who choose to be loyal towards him.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, exactly.
yeah, it's like a 1-2 punch where like even if you're not willing to admit that you're afraid of him, maybe those Republicans, those people that were like smiling and acting like very enthusiastically greeting him and saying that he gave the best State of the Union of all time or whatever other BS. Like all of those people, even the people that were consciously feeling like they felt joy, like even those people, maybe they were afraid and weren't willing to admit it to themselves.
Yeah, I think it's definitely. I think definitely there is elements to that, and I feel like if I look at different situations in life, I must have had this act myself at different points in life without necessarily thinking about it. It's just a kind of natural human trait, I think, to be kind of compliant when you just feel intimidated by someone. And someone like Trump, who's just willing to use any means possible against people, take away your security.
Yeah. Or he'll send a violent mob to try to kill you if you like respect democracy.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you just talk vile, and then he's got his oath keepers and his Proud Boys, basically his brown shirts, out for pretty violent acts. Do you want to really speak out against him when he's just there's this like there's something from history. Who will rid me of this troublesome bishop or priest? The king is saying something like that. He doesn't actually order a killing, but it's like it's a carte blanche, right? And I think that there's a lot of what would you call it, stochastic terrorism or something, right? His voice and his words are so powerful. He has such devoted followers. It is genuinely dangerous to go against him. Maybe, and I mean, I don't care much because I'm not important enough, so I can say all sorts of nasty things about MAGA or Trump. But if you were somebody,
exactly, yeah, keep going.
Yeah, because you see that in Russia. I talked to Russians about what does it feel like, living under Putin and so on, and they remark on this that even if it's sort of like a dictatorship, I think this is what we get wrong about dictatorship, is that if you're a nobody, you can say a lot. But as soon as you're a somebody, you can't say a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
And that goes at many levels. I think it's just like, Elon Musk with all the power he has. You can't just go out like a 15-year-old edgelord. You can't just tweet, overthrow the British government, right? There's a responsibility with your influence. And I think this also... that goes in democracy, but it also goes in dictatorships, right? If you have a strong voice, they're going to come after you if you say things that we could get away from saying.
Yeah. I think it is so important for us to like, we're outsiders looking in, like neither of us support the MAGA movement, to like try to do our best to simultaneously acknowledge the times when we think that they're completely wrong, while still like welcoming them to be part of our following. So like you actually wrote one article titled "I Welcome Trump Supporters," where you sort of work through the logic of that a little bit, where you still like full-throatedly condemn everything they do, but like if they're willing to like bear with you and continue reading your content, then that's fine. Like that's more than fine. You strongly encourage that. Could you talk about that a little bit more and how that relates to how important it is to try to persuade these types of people?
I wrote that as a reaction to somebody who was saying that he lost, for something he said, he lost a lot of subscribers. And he was like, if you're a Trump supporter, if you stand for this and that, I don't want you to follow me. I want you to leave. And I thought about that and it's like, that's not really what I believe in. I do actually believe in engaging. And I've done this balance where I think is a bit difficult, but I've done this balance where I actually been very vocal about how bad I think somebody's views are. I remember this guy that I call straight. I said, I think you're a misogynist. And we had a bit of back and forth, and he was really angry at me and just kind of cussing me out. But the thing was, he had other admirable traits. And I pointed that out, he was a hard worker. He was very ambitious. He was very successful. And I said, very principled in a lot of ways. And I said, yeah, those are admirable traits. And I think that, you have a lot of things to be proud of. And it was funny how that switched to things. Like, we actually kind of became friends. And so I was able to actually have friendly engagement with this guy, despite the fact that I was very openly, clearly saying, you are a misogynist. I hate everything and how you relate to women. But we could actually still respect. And this is what I learned this from actually raising kids. Is it's very important to give compliments to people for things that are genuinely good things. Like, and I think many people struggle with that. If there's somebody they don't like, they don't want to compliment them about anything.
Yeah, even if they actually do genuinely good things.
Yeah, exactly. And I think if you're willing to compliment people that do bad things, they might be willing to listen to you, because people that just tear you down in every possible way, it's like, well, why should I listen to that person? He's not, he doesn't care about anything I say. He's never going to take in good faith anything I say, because he's choosing to see everything about me as negative. And so I make a point of this, of like Elon Musk, which I strongly dislike. I still keep arguing with left-wingers about this, because I think that what he did with SpaceX, with the rocket industry, what he did with electrification and transportation, I think those are genuinely good things. And I think it shows that he had genuinely good leadership skills in making that happen, even if I think he has cheated and done a lot of immoral things to make that happen. But you can't just only be immoral and make it happen. I mean, it's just like a mobster boss, right? They're brutal and they use violence to get their ways, but usually they're also successful because they have some kind of talent at what they do, right? There's lots of, I think that's important to recognize, lots of people that are bad in different ways have many positive traits and talents that you just can't deny. You have to be able to accept that.
Yeah.
And I think if you do, they'll be willing to listen to you, and might be listened to, be able to listen to your criticism. This guy I kept calling a misogynist straight to his face. He actually started to move a little bit on that, because he was struggling in his relationship with his girlfriend. That made him realize I had some points about what I said.
Yeah. There was one quote where you were talking about like a scene where you saw this one Republican talking with a Democrat, and it was over like a Trump-related issue. And the Republican, Roger Wicker, you sort of tried to inhabit his head, and why it is so like hard for us to switch identities and how that relates to MAGA. So I'm going to quote that. Quote, "I don't know Senator Roger Wicker, but I like to imagine he is a classic Republican, grew up around other deeply religious and conservative people. He had a military career, which means many of the people he worked with were likely conservative as well, so his friends and colleagues are likely conservative. Now he is facing a reality in which the morally right thing to do is to turn your back on the Republican Party and side with the Democrats." Like, do you think it's hard? Like, it's genuinely hard if you identify yourself where like you're not having like a rational idea of like, I support this policy because logical point A, B, and C. It's more like you have a need to stay consistent with yourself. Like, there's this quote from the motivational speaker Tony Robbins where he says, "The strongest force in human personality is the need to stay consistent with how we define ourselves." So if you've spent your entire life identifying as a religious conservative, even if intellectually you know that it's wrong for Donald Trump to engage in victim blaming towards Ukraine or to try to deny elections that he lost, like, even though intellectually you know that's wrong, like, the pull from your tribe, the pull from your identity is just like blindsidedly, like, it's so overwhelmingly great that it's like genuinely hard to switch positions because you feel like you're switching identities. So maybe to the Republicans that are trying their hardest, maybe we should extend a little bit of sympathy towards them, just like it is hard for us to change our identities in the midst of the fact that we are in a very different political environment than we were in a few months ago.
Yeah, I mean, I find it's like, I have problems articulating exactly how you go about this, because it's like that balancing that you should be honest and point out that they are supporting truly horrible things, and it's a moral failing on their part. At the same time, I think you have to recognize that people can make mistakes and people can change, right? I don't think it's like people aren't necessarily inherently evil or bad or anything like that. They can have periods in their life where they're embracing things that are really bad, and they can change. I mean, where I live, I remember I shook hands with a guy who was a violent gangster when I was growing up, and I remember talking with my brother about how this was just the biggest piece of shit that we could imagine when we read about the things he did. And now he was this positive force here in my local community, helping troubled kids, helping with sports and so on. And it was kind of like, example of just how really bad people can change. And so you can't say that someone is just built into their body a sort of level of goodness or badness, right? You can be periods of your life where you're a bad person, or you can periods where you're good. And so we have to recognize that people that are making these bad choices, they can change. And when they do, we should accept them and let them in, We can't just be like, oh, well, you were bad, so we're never going to accept you. But they have to, I feel like they have to sort of repent a bit too. I mean, I see all these Trumpers that, oh, I regret I voted on Trump because now it's hitting back on me. Well, I like to see that you actually talk about the other people that got hurt besides yourself, right? Because otherwise, are you stop being selfish at all? I think that's something a little bit, you have to be a little, I mean, you can accept them, but I think we have to be a little demanding too. You have to accept also that you maybe been a bit selfish, and you also need to think about others besides just yourself, that there's other people who've been hurt from this.
Yeah. So that does make me wonder, because I think that the transition of the Republican Party in the US was gradual, but I think it was a lot more contingent on Trump than other people. Because it is true that we have had right-wing sentiment and reactionary populism for a long time. But I think that we would not have anywhere close to what we're having right now if it were not for Donald Trump. So I think, for example, George W. Bush is someone that did a lot of terrible things, like invading Iraq, but he also did a lot of genuinely good things, like increasing the millions of dollars that were spent on foreign aid, or PEPFAR was a program that saved millions and millions of people that he deliberately funded to help deal with HIV or AIDS in African countries. And I find it hard to extend that same level of gratitude when it comes to the things that Donald Trump does, particularly because of the ways that he warps people's identity. The whole thing about how if you were to engage in sexual harassment in a job interview, the reaction from that, those people would be to actively be more compliant and more agreeable towards you. I think that a microcosm of that occurred during the 2016 GOP primary debates, where when Trump first announced that he was running for president, he was treated as a complete joke by everyone. And there was one point where Jeb Bush, who was a forerunner, or he was thought of as a forerunner for the nominee.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, he looked at Trump and with a little bit of mild confusion, and he was like, "You're not going to insult your way to the presidency. That's not how this is going to go." And then Donald Trump basically he basically just insulted all of them until they were willing to bend the knee towards him. I think that's kind of that's a microcosm of how the broader conservative movement in America shifted over time. There's this one political commentator that I follow, David French, who is a never-Trumper evangelical who basically got canceled by his church for his support for Trump. But one observation that he made that was interesting is that conservatives in America, when they first supported Trump in 2016, they supported Trump because they thought of him as the lesser of two evils. They thought of him as I think that both Hillary and Trump are bad, but I think Trump is less bad, and that's why they supported him. But then as MAGA became bigger and bigger over time, as the first presidential administration kept going and kept going, more and more of their identity was tied to MAGA. More and more of their conception of themselves was tied for their support of Trump, because of the fact that they were staunch Republicans and Trump got elected president, and he kept defining the Republican talking points for 4 straight years. As that kept happening, they kept getting closer and closer to seeing Trump less as a pragmatically correct choice and more as supporting him was a core part of their identity. And I think that that's why getting harder and harder to like de-radicalize the hardcore base, because he's been in like, this has been years in the making, is what I'm trying to say. You know?
Yeah, no, that definitely how I see it too, that it's they've just been pulled into this, and it's been, you know, it's become just hard to unwind yourself from it now, because now you become so invested in it. You have sort of, I guess if somebody joins a gang and then they participate, so this is an extreme example, but I sometimes think it's just like with science fiction, you make extreme versions of reality in a way to highlight reality. And if you join a gang and you participate in their violence and their drug dealing and so on, at some point you can't really get out because you're too deep in it, right? You are guilty too now. You dealt the drugs, you beat up people and so on.
Yeah, like that's become part of the way that you define yourself in your head.
Yeah, and there's also a danger stepping up, I guess, because if you do, you've done enough that you face serious problems. I think that a lot of the things that the way the Trump movement has been moving, they're starting far into illegal territory. So it's almost like, you know, the mob. And that means that a lot of people support him have in many ways broken the law. And if they don't keep supporting him, they could face consequences they don't want to face.
Yeah.
So there,
it's an
easy way out now.
There's no easy way out. And so like, I keep coming back to like the images in my head where Trump finishes the State of the Union and like all the Republicans just like keep enthusiastically greeting him. Once again, they're choosing to feel joy because they're afraid of feeling fear. Like I think that's what I would choose, like the TLDR for the way that a lot of like.
Yeah, I mean, isn't it a little bit like a Godfather moment? They're all coming up, kissing his ring, kind of. They're all smiling and whatever because they know he's the Don. He's a dangerous guy.
Yeah, like I think that's the way that things have changed over time. Where like when Trump was first running in 2016, like there was at least like a small grain of truth to his critiques. Like he yelled at the Republican Party for their support of the Iraq War while he was being booed by everyone on stage. Like he represented a lot of the populist discontent that happened as a result of the War on Terror and the Great Recession of 2008, where like he still did a lot of abhorrent things and he still should have been condemned, but there was at least a grain of truth to his critique. But like ever since he got elected president, he basically took that grain of truth and then like used that support that he got from the grain of truth to just like spew more and more lies. And like the more people accept those lies, the more that they become part of their identity, and the more like Trump supporters end up feeling like they're in too deep.
Yeah, and I mean, I can relate to some things that is, you know, a big problem here in Europe, which is, you know, the immigration waves that have grown huge. And I wrote an article about this too, that traditional parties haven't really been able to tackle it very well, the world we live in now. And I think that's what you see in the United States, and you see it in Europe as well. And I think, you know, a lot of what we tried on the left, which is we're trying to be positive to new citizens in the country. So, you know, if you're going to integrate people and give them a future, you can't just going around with, you know, being a racist. But at the same time, they haven't had really an answer to that. It's kind of unsustainable in many ways. And the left has had doesn't really know how to talk about it. Like, how do you talk about this without being kind of a racist, but also tackling it? And so they're giving away the whole thing.
That means that like the truthful bits end up being inhabited by the racists, where only the racists are willing to say the grain of truth that you're not willing to say. Yeah,
exactly. And I don't know if the left has a way of tackling that, because I know that I'm very torn on this, because I mean, my wife is an immigrant, and I live in an area that's predominantly minority area in Norway. I'm the minority. And so we see both the things that work and don't work. If you listen to sort of the far right kind of organizations. They present it as if this is a no-go zone that I live in, and it's also terrible. But that's not my experience. I've lived there for like 13 years, and I generally had good experiences. But we also can see problems, and it's that kind of mix of issues where people don't want to talk about the issues because the problem is also like if you raise some of the issues, the right might run with it and use it to advance xenophobia and racism. So you don't even know what you're supposed to say.
Yeah.
Because you know it's going to be abused. And that means that they take ownership of the issue, right? They can say, oh, the left's not doing anything about immigration and so on. And I think it's a kind of crisis that a lot of I think the far right rise in Europe has connections with the U.S. too, that we also face a mass migration wave that we haven't figured out exactly how to best deal with. But I think the analysis of the right, that's the problem, because they define the issue, they come with this crazy analysis of it where it's just like liberals have decided to replace white people as some kind of deep state evil conspiracy.
Oh, the great replacement theory, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I see this much more like technology oriented, that you can be in the depths of Africa, for instance, and you can use a smartphone and you can connect and figure out what is it like living in, say, Sweden. And you can, through that smartphone, you can figure out connections for people to transport you, and you can make that whole journey all the way to Europe. So you're getting really distant migrations that if you go to the 1980s, people fled to their neighboring country. Now they're making very long trips, and I think that's part of why you're seeing these great migration waves in many ways. It's not some liberal conspiracy. I see much more of a technology is a big part of it. Like, I mean, you see in the U.S., I think also you've seen people from Guatemala, very quite distant places that are crossing the border from Mexico. It's not just Mexicans. Maybe it's not even, maybe most of them aren't even Mexicans. I'm not really sure what the situation is in the U.S. today. But Mexico's fairly well developed as far as I know, so maybe not so.
Yeah, and the sad thing is that, like, before Trump, the U.S. was like empirically much, much better at assimilating immigrants than like comparable European countries were. And I think that part of the reason why is that I think that there was like sort of like I don't know if other people would characterize it this way, but I think that before Trump, there was sort of like an unspoken agreement between politicians on both sides of the aisle to not use populist rhetoric about immigration. And then Trump came along and then realized that that was like fertile soil that he could exploit.
Let's just call all of them criminals and rapists and murderers. And it's like, what?
Yeah.
And maybe it just pans into the feeling, right? You can see stories and so on, you can see crime, and people want to have an explanation, something to blame, someone to channel their anger. And he's the guy.
Yeah, like, I think that part of the way that we counter this is by like acknowledging the small grains of truth that these populist commentators have, while condemning the reactionary elements. Like, for example, since we brought this up earlier, I do think there's a grain of truth where I do think that there has been a failure on the American left to not be sufficiently attuned to the struggles that like young men have when it comes to dating. But part of the reason why I know that is that like there are some commentators on the left or the center within American politics that are willing to acknowledge those struggles without ever like becoming reactionary and like still condemning the more misogynistic elements of places like the manosphere, which I think I'm very glad that those places do exist.
Yeah, that's an interesting, like, if you look in different cultures, because, you know, Norway is a lot more feminist than the U.S., but I feel we don't have the same conflict as the U.S. because the feminism here is more secure. It doesn't need the same strong rhetoric. It's actually possible here to talk about men's issues more, maybe a bit more genuinely in a way. It doesn't become this sort of, oh, are you an Andrew Tate fan or whatever. And I think that with a lot of things, it's just, I think I mentioned that somewhere else that, you know, because you don't have a strong religious movement here, you can be more openly, say, atheist. Maybe that's fine now, but at least when I was in the U.S. 20 years ago, it just felt like you couldn't just say you were an atheist. It was almost saying like you were a devil worshiper. And I think this kind of, when you have this kind of very tense environment or cultural war environment, you kind of amp up each side. Everyone becomes much more militant in their views and expressions. So you can end up with this sort of weird thing where maybe the feminism in the United States can sound more militant and aggressive, even though the U.S. isn't very feminist relative to, say, here. But here it's like they're in such a comfortable position, they can be more more embracing of other views than maybe it's possible when you have a much stronger culture war situation going on. And then I guess each side is just going to blame each other, right? They're just going to aggressively throw insults. I'm not sure how to deal with that, but
maybe acknowledging its existence as a problem is the first step, at least. Yeah. It definitely. It's. I think you have to recognize that both on the left and the right, people start assuming more radical or extreme rhetoric because the other side is quite extreme. So it's it feeds off each other, right? I guess that's why things can just spiral out of control after a while. Yeah. The final question. So, like, let's say that you're part of like the small percentage of this podcast audience that is like a Trump supporter or is more like MAGA curious. Based on your own assessment about how you misjudged Trump supporters in the past, what would you say to those people now if they're listening?
Oh, you think about like inviting them in, or why they should change, or what do you have in mind then?
Like the sense of the emotional tenor that you feel about them right now.
I'm very mixed, and I think it's almost like my answer will vary depending on the day or depending on the hour or whatever.
Yeah, but maybe you can give like 3 or 4 answers where they're all exactly. Different parts of yourself. Yeah.
I think I have, I must admit, and I think this is good to be honest about it, I must admit I have a fair amount of disgust about this people. I can't lie about that, but it's also, right, I know that maybe I'm not reasonable about this, right? But it's like I'm a human and I feel this. Like there's
a gap between what an ideal self would feel and the way that you currently feel because of the fact that you're human. Yeah.
Yeah. So I do think that they've done a sort of immorally wrong choice, but I'm still willing to engage with them. I still want to hear their views and debate them. And as long as we can have a debate where it's just not trying to do this sort of gotcha thing or like, own the libs or whatever, like you can actually discuss the issues. It doesn't necessarily mean that you can't characterize the other, because I don't think that's fair either. Like I think I'm entitled to characterize them in a bit like negative way because of what they follow, but I could still do that without going into this sort of gotcha kind of argumentation where I'm not actually genuinely trying to reach any kind of conclusion.
So it's still fine to characterize them as reactionary, but it's better to do that as an observation rather than like a moral judgment. Is that what you mean?
I'm actually okay with the moral judgment. It's just that I don't have to sort of like, I can still respond to the points they make, argue the issue instead of just coming with a crap shot. And my point is more like, I can say that I think that you're doing a moral failing here, but I can still say when they raise an issue, I can still give a serious answer. I don't have to sort of give a sort of a joke answer or sarcastic answer. Take serious the things they're saying, even if you're not. I don't feel I have to sugarcoat what I necessarily feel about it, but I don't have to spit it in their face all the time what I feel about them, right? If I ask, how do you feel about me? And my, I can be honest, like, I like you for this and that, but I think you're on this particular year, I think you screwed up. Honestly, you made a bad choice.
Yeah,
really, but maybe one.
Yeah, but like, what if, like, let's say that they do, like, maybe there is a part of themselves that is secretly afraid, and they're like only starting to they're only very starting to acknowledge that because of just how far deep they are. If they're like a little bit afraid, what would you tell them?
Maybe one of the things I would try, a little bit of what I try when I argue with, because I see you can't really change people easily. I think one of the things I try is to try to get across that a lot of us on the left are not as crazy as they think. And I use myself a little bit as example is that, I'm far left and they have all sorts of ideas that I'm going to have all these crazy ideas because I am that. And I'm trying to get across is showing them that, hey, there's a bunch of things we can actually agree on. I'm not as crazy as you think. And I don't think I'm alone in that. If you want to find a home on the left, it is possible. I'm also critical of a lot of woke stuff. So if you think that if you're critical of wokeism, you can't be on the left at all, you're wrong. It's possible to be here and disagree on things. Sure, I can get pile-ons from other fellow leftists, but the point is like, are you only going to choose your politics based on being loved for every view you have? Or are you willing to just accept that not everyone's going to agree on me in my tribe, if you will? And isn't this what we should be, that we should dare to be in whatever political affiliation we have and still maybe have some unpopular views within that sphere? Because that, in a way, it shows that you are thinking for yourself and you're not being a tribalist. Because I think that's the most dangerous we have now. It's tribalism. It's just trying to check all the boxes on the belief that, if you're leftist, you have to believe this. If you're right, you have to believe this. Make it possible to say you can be on the left, even if maybe you reject a lot of the stuff we stand for. Maybe you agree with some of the things if you're actually willing to listen to what we have to say. I don't know.
Erik Engheim, thank you so much for having this conversation. I really loved it.
Yeah, you too. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to hear more, make sure to follow this podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or anywhere else that you get your podcasts from. Until next time, goodbye.